Excerpts from Part 1, Chapter 5 of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. Into War. On USC's track team, Louis was a juggernaut. Focused on winning in Tokyo in 1940, he smashed record after record at multiple distances and routinely buried his competition by giant margins, once winning a race by 100 yards. By the spring of 1938, he'd whittled his mile time down to 4 minutes 13.7 seconds, some 7 seconds off the world record, which now stood at 4 minutes 6.4 seconds. His coach predicted that Louis would take that record down. The only runner who could beat him, the coach said, was Seabiscuit. In the 1930s, track experts were beginning to toss around the idea of a 4-minute mile. Most observers, including Cunningham, had long believed that it couldn't be done. In 1935, when Cunningham's record of 4 minutes 6.7 seconds reigned, science weighed in. Studying data on human structural limits compiled by Finnish mathematicians, famed track coach Brutus Hamilton penned an article for Amateur Athlete magazine stating that a 4-minute mile was impossible. The fastest a human could run a mile, he wrote, was 4 minutes 1.6 seconds. Pete disagreed. Since the Olympics, he'd been certain that Louis had a 4-minute mile in him. Louis had always shaken this off, but in the spring of '38, he reconsidered. His coach had forbidden him to run hills on the mistaken but common belief that it would damage his heart. But Louis didn't buy the warnings. Every night that May, he climbed the Coliseum fence, dropped into the stadium, and ran the stairs until his legs went numb. By June, his body was humming, capable of speed and stamina beyond anything he'd ever known. He began to think that Pete was right, and he wasn't alone. Running pundits, including Olympic champion sprinter Charlie Paddock, published articles stating that Louis could be the first 4-minute man. Cunningham, too, had changed his mind. He thought that 4 minutes might be within Louis's reach. Zamperini, Cunningham told a reporter, was more likely to crack 4 minutes than he was. In June 1938, Louis arrived at the NCAA championships in Minneapolis, gunning for 4 minutes. Spilling over with eagerness, he babbled to other athletes about his new training regimen, his race strategy, and how fast he might go. Word spread that Louis was primed for a superlative performance. On the night before the race, a coach from Notre Dame knocked on Louis's hotel room door, a grave expression on his face. He told Louis that some of his rival coaches were ordering their runners to sharpen their spikes and slash him. Louis dismissed the warning, certain that no one would do such a thing deliberately. He was wrong. Halfway through the race, just as Louis was about to move for the lead, several runners shouldered around him, boxing him in. Louis tried repeatedly to break loose, but he couldn't get around the other men. Suddenly, the man beside him swerved in and stomped on his foot, impaling Louis's toe with his spike. A moment later, the man ahead began kicking backward, cutting both of Louis's shins. A third man elbowed Louis's chest so hard that he cracked Louis's rib. The crowd gasped. Bleeding and in pain, Louis was trapped. For a lap and a half he ran in the cluster of men, unable to get free, restraining his stride to avoid running into the man ahead. At last, as he neared the final turn, he saw a tiny gap open before him. He burst through, blew past the race leader, and with his shoe torn open, shins streaming blood, and chest aching, won easily. He slowed to a halt, bitter and frustrated. When his coach asked him how fast he thought he had gone, Louis replied that he couldn't have beaten 4 minutes 20 seconds. The race time was posted on the board. From the stands came a sudden woo! Louis had run the mile in 4 minutes, 8.3 seconds. It was the fastest NCAA mile in history and the 5th fastest outdoor mile ever run. Louis had missed the world record by 1.9 seconds. His time would stand as the NCAA record for 15 years. In the late 1930s, both Germany and Japan were ready to move. It was Japan that struck first in 1937, sending its armies smashing into the rest of China. 2 years later, Hitler invaded Poland. America, long isolationist, found itself pulled into both conflicts. In Europe, its allies lay in Hitler's path. In the Pacific, its longtime ally China was being ravaged by the Japanese. And its territories of Hawaii, Wake, Guam, and Midway, as well as its Commonwealth of the Philippines, were threatened. The world was falling into catastrophe. On a dark day in April 1940, Louis returned to his bungalow to find the USC campus buzzing. Hitler had unleashed his blitzkrieg across Europe, his Soviet allies had followed, and the continent had exploded into total war. Finland, which was set to host the Summer Games, was reeling. Helsinki's Olympic Stadium was partially collapsed, toppled by Soviet bombs. Gunnar Hockert, who had beaten Louis and won gold for Finland in the 5,000 in Berlin, was dead, killed defending his homeland. The Olympics had been canceled. Ever since his trip in the air as a boy, he'd been uneasy about planes, but watching the P-38s, he felt a pull. He was still feeling it in September when Congress enacted a draft bill. Those who enlisted prior to being drafted could choose their service branch. In early 1941, Louis joined the Army Air Corps. Sent to the Hancock College of Aeronautics in Santa Maria, California, Louis learned that flying a plane was nothing like watching it from the ground. He was jittery and dogged by air sickness. He washed out of the Air Corps, signed papers that he didn't bother to read, and got a job as a movie extra. He was working on the set of They Died with Their Boots On, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, when a letter arrived. He'd been drafted.